welcome. I will be introducing the great panelists a little bit later after a brief presentation, and I'm sure most of you have seen who that is already. Before we get into the details, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why we're having the event here today. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So why a Just Livestock Transition? Well, some of you will know what this is, some of you might not, and most of you will definitely know what a just transition is within energy work. So the big transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable energy-based economy has been a massive thing, particularly within climate change over the last 10 to 15 years. And now we're starting to see the just transition within agriculture as well, food systems. And for those who are following the Food Systems Summit, which is going to take place in 2 days, you'll know that it has slowly been creeping up the agenda as an issue to discuss, often very controversial and often splitting lots of opinions about how to go about doing it best. So we think having this event 2 days prior to the Food Systems Summit, and indeed about a month and a bit before the COP in Glasgow, is a good opportunity to discuss this in more detail. So in a nutshell, you know, even if we were to cut down on all emissions coming from energy tomorrow, we would still hardly be able to stay within 1.5 degrees above pre-industrialized levels, simply because not only is the livestock industry, the agriculture and livestock industry contributing so much to climate change, it is also on a trajectory to increase. So there's big issues we need to address there. So all analysis say that unless we do actually reduce the numbers of animals produced and consumed, we will not be able to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, or even be able to work safely within the Convention on Biological Diversity. Essentially, we'll not be able to stay within the planetary boundaries. And why is that? Well, industrialized livestock, and it's important also to just want to make one thing clear here. There's a difference between industrialized livestock and that of smallholders, pastoralists, and indigenous communities. We're focusing here on industrialized livestock, the big CAFOs, the big industrial production systems, particularly in the global north, particularly in G20 countries. And so the science on this is clear. The industrial livestock industry is having lots of negative impacts on the world, essentially. There is, of course, significant methane ammonia emissions. It's just confirmed again, excuse me, recently with the IPCC report. It leads to tropical deforestation, is one of the biggest contributors to tropical deforestation. Global hunger, well, that relates to equitable or inequitable food distribution and the fact that we have to produce so much feed to feed these animals instead of feeding people directly. And there are lots of human rights violations related to this, not just in terms of where the deforestation is taking place in countries, particularly in Latin America, but also very much in some of the processing plants and slaughterhouses, and which we saw, unfortunately, during the first big breakout of COVID, where a lot of workers in slaughterhouses and processing plants were the biggest victims of bad working conditions. And there's so many other things: soil degradation, air pollution, water contamination, and of course, biodiversity loss, which is unfortunately another big side effect. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do with the Just Livestock Transition, well, essentially it's a way to try to establish a transition away from what we have now to a place where there is safety for the planet, safety for climate change, safety for the consumers, for the workers, and doing so in a way that respects what has been so far and where we're heading. We cannot just shut everything down in 1 second and say, well, that's the way it is. I'm sorry, folks. We need to talk about how to really make sure that nobody is left behind. And that applies particularly also to farmers, of course. You would have seen in the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, there's been a lot of focus on reschooling or retraining people who worked in, for instance, coal plants or oil refineries, or even having compensation plans for when there was no way of transitioning to something new. People who have dedicated their lives and cannot do anything else, are not able to do anything else, should of course be compensated if their work closes down, because the world wants to see this transition. And in many ways, we want to try to see the same thing happening within the Food Systems Summit. So, sorry, within Just Livestock Transition. So if you're looking at, one big benchmark is 2030, the SDGs, which is just under 9 years from now. By then, we need definitely to have a different food system in place, one that works within planetary boundaries, can feed the growing population, but also works within the boundaries of ensuring human rights, ensuring workers' rights, and ensuring that everything is done in a way that also eliminates the current imbalance we're seeing global north to global south. And some of the key things we need to focus on is what is on the screen here. We need to work on the socioeconomics and demonstrate how the farming system actually can become a net creator of jobs. And we'll hear more about that in our talk today. It also relates to public health. There is a strong correlation, particularly in G7 countries, between the increased, the high and increased consumption of animal products and cardiovascular diseases, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and so forth. So there's a big health issue as well. So we can free up more land, which can be used for conservation, which is good for biodiversity, which is good for people, and particularly in those zones where there's conflicts between production and indigenous and rural economies, communities, that can be improved. We need to ensure food sovereignty. We don't need to just turn the world over to eating no meat at all, and just it's a one-for-one. We really need to ensure that the production and the ownership of food transitions more and more to people. People should be able to produce the food they want in the way they want, where they live. And of course, the health I touched base on as well. And the socioeconomics, all studies, again, we'll talk about that later, all studies point to the fact that when you shift to more plant-rich production systems, you are in fact really likely to create more jobs, better jobs, safer jobs, more gender equitable jobs, and so forth. So there's so many positive aspects of making this shift. Next slide, please. So to do that, and of course, leading up to, as I mentioned in the beginning, to the Food System Summit, which we have in just 2 days from now, we being 50 by 40, and many of our partners and also the esteemed speakers who are on this call here today, which I'll introduce momentarily, have been speaking about how can we make this transition and where do we need to put some attention and some focus. And particularly leading up to the Food System Summit, the first of its kind ever, which is happening on Thursday, and of course the COP in November in Glasgow, we thought it's important to make a strong statement about Just Livestock Transition and how it really plays into everything that we need to do in shifting the food system. So therefore, we put together this open letter that speaks to some of the key points, which I mentioned before, what the problem is, why we need to shift, when we need to shift, and who should be engaged. And the outcome of this letter will then be shared when we have enough signatories, when we have the right people there. We will share it with the stakeholders, the main stakeholders we're trying to influence with this, which are member state representatives. And when it comes to, for instance, the COP in Glasgow, we'll be particularly focused in on the need to ensure that livestock production becomes inherent, a core part of the NDCs, the natural determined contributions, so the national climate change plans of all the member states. Some member states are already dealing with that, but very few, and it needs to really go up to the problem, because there's a massive discrepancy between how big the problem with livestock and industrial livestock is and how little attention it's getting in climate change mitigation work. That goes for the political process, and as it happens also for the process of financing climate change mitigation work, whether it's public or private. So we put together this letter, and it's open for everybody to sign. We are, of course, focusing specifically on organizations and individuals who are engaged in this space. So we can take to the next slide, please. See, this is some of the organization that already has signed on to the letter. And a lot of them you can see are 50 by 40 partners. Some are not. And we also have a lot of individuals signed up to that, including some of the people who are going to be speaking here today. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the conversation here today, because being true to what I said before and trying to emphasize the complexity of this issue and how many different stakeholders are involved in it, we need to be able to talk to the overall holistic approach to foods. We need to talk about how the farmers deal with it. We need to talk about how the investors deal with it. We need to talk about how the future inhabitants of this planet, the youth, is addressing this. Now we need to talk about how the social scientists, the academics are dealing with it, and we need to talk about how we deal with it and in a multilateral space, particularly when it comes to MDBs and investments and major shifts across regions. And it just so happens that all these amazing issues can be covered by the esteemed speakers we have here today. So in a moment, I'm going to be handing over to our keynote speaker today, Anna Lappe. I don't think she needs more introduction, but just for the record, she's a best-selling author, she's the educator and internationally recognized expert on food systems. And one of the things she's probably going to be mentioning is the 50th anniversary of the Diet for a Small Planet, the book her mom published 50 years ago today that really changed the scene around food production. So she's going to be talking in a moment. Then we're going to be hearing from a plethora of amazing individuals. AJ Vijayakarta, who's the chairman of the Bharat Krishna Samaj. I'm sorry, AJ, I try to get it right every time I say it. He's also the vice chair of sustainable consumption and UN food champion at the UN Food Systems Summit, and indeed himself a farmer in India. We'll also be hearing from Dr. Helena Wright, who is the policy director at Fair Initiative. Helena has a vast experience working particularly in the climate change space and can talk a lot about how the investment community is engaging in this issue we're discussing today as well. Lana Wittgenand is also an esteemed speaker. She is the vice chair of the Food Systems Summit Action Track 2 on Sustainable Consumption. She's also the deputy director of 0 Hour International, which is this huge international youth group that is really gaining more traction, and a group that gives me better sleep at night, because I know when I retire at some point, there are really amazing people who's going to be taking forward the good fight. We'll also be hearing from Adrian Wojcielp, who is the senior economist from the Inter-American Development Bank, and indeed the guy I mentioned in my talk before, who can speak much more to the potential job creation aspects of shifting to a more plant-rich food. And then we'll also be hearing from Dr. Charlotte Blattner, who's a senior lecturer and researcher at the Institute of Public Law, Faculty of Law, and University of Bern. And Charlotte is one of the key thinkers around just transition and how it relates to just livestock transition, and has spent significant amount of time really putting the detailed thinking into how can we actually do this. So first, we're going to hear from Anna, then we're going to go straight into hearing from the individual speakers. I won't be doing this introduction to them again. So this was it. Make your notes, do a print screen so you have it, or check the invitation, you have it there as well. We hear from Anna, then we hear from the speakers, and then we're going to go into a debate. Next slide, please. And just before we hear from Anna, we invite you to go into Slido and start posing questions for the debate we're going to be having later on. So all the information is here. You can take your phone now and just scan this QWERTY code on the screen, or you can go into Slido, sli.do, and just put JLT and will come up there. And I know that the link is also going to be put in the chat box now. Please ask your questions. Please be provocative, be visionary, and let's come out of this event today having learned something new, all of us. Without further ado, I would now like to hand over to Anna Lappe. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks so much. It is a real pleasure to be here. And as I was listening to your opening remarks, Lasse, I was just thinking about how exciting it is to feel like there is now a truly global, really powerful conversation about the need for a just livestock transition, and that there is now a really global conversation about these intersections between food and climate in a way that we've never seen before. So it's really exciting to be here. I think in the few minutes that I have, I will be echoing a lot of what you have already said, Lasse, and sharing 3 ideas for ways that we might want to think about the approach to this just livestock transition. And as Lasse said, it's really special for me to be here today. This is, as he mentioned, the 50th anniversary of my mother's book, Diet for a Small Planet. And together, she and I just published a new edition, and today is the launch day. So it's special to be here for that reason as well. The original book, for those of you who don't know, was published in 1971, and it was part political treatise. It was about her sharing her research about the wastefulness promise of the grain-fed industrial livestock model that was just taking off in the early 1970s, but it was also half vegetarian cookbook. It brought to life kind of a corollary message, which was that we don't need to buy into that way of raising food, that we could survive, indeed thrive on plant-centered diets. Together at the time, those messages were heretical, seen as very radical. Today, I would argue they are common sense. I was noting that American author Michael Pollan pretty much summed up her dietary message in just 7 words: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So it's both a common sense message and one that can be quite simplified. But today, as we talk about this idea of a just transition in livestock, we are standing on these 5 decades of history and beyond. We're standing on thousands of pages of evidence, millions of acres of agricultural land that's shown us what this kind of model does to biodiversity, to ecosystems. We are also seeing the lives of farmers and workers who've been impacted by this industry. And all of which I think is making it clearer than ever, as Lasse alluded to, that we really need not just a transition, but a rapid transition toward systems that are more environmentally beneficial, to systems that don't have such incredibly huge impacts on working conditions, to systems that are better for our health as well. So just as we know we need this rapid, radical transition in energy, transportation, we also need this in food system models and transitions that are grounded in ecology and justice. But despite what we know about the transition needed, what we are seeing in our national diet here in the United States, but also increasingly global, is really a ongoing move in the opposite direction. A diet maybe that we could sum up in 9 words: ultra processed meat and junk food, and too much of both. Today, 60% of the calories Americans eat come from ultra-processed foods. We're seeing overall meat production has quadrupled in these past 50 years, far outpacing population growth. And The Lancet recently published a global assessment that found that 1 in 5 deaths are now diet-related. We also know, as Lasse talked about already, that a huge portion, 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions, are coming from our food system, and that meat is responsible for approximately 60% of that cost, according to new, recently peer-reviewed published studies. So we also know, as Lasse said, that the current projections for growth in the industrial livestock sector would push us beyond our carbon budget to meet our Paris climate goals. So we know we need this rapid transition. We also, the good news is we have the solutions. We know both what kind of food we need to be eating. We know how to be raising livestock in a way that's better for the planet. We have model policies ready to be scaled up that we can support for such production shifts. But I would argue that all of the strategies that we know we need to be embracing mean taking on industries that currently have powerful ties to our political systems. It means taking on industries that have incredible investment in the status quo. And it means taking on companies that have been using their economic power to shape what's politically possible for decades. A recent 2017 IPES food report also pointed out how much those industries have increasingly consolidated their power. As they wrote, the IPES food report stated, "We've seen unprecedented consolidation in the past decade in seed, agrochemical, fertilizer, animal genetics, and farm machinery industries, all of the industries that play a vital role in industrial livestock production." In the United States, we've seen that kind of corporate influence of our politics. In the last time I looked, the most recent numbers showed that there are more than 1,000 agribusiness lobbyists now in Washington, D.C., 50% more than from oil and gas, that are working to shape what our legislators craft into policy and in whose interests they're working. So these are the stakes. This is why political change can be so hard. So in the last couple of minutes I have with you, what are some approaches to really be pushing forward the kind of change we need? Number one, we really need to be promoting big tent organizing, which is what I think 50 by 40 does so well, but also at the same time exposing conflicts of interest, being careful about where we see them appear. We need every sector to be engaged, but we also really need to contain that corporate influence over policy and agenda setting. It's a concern that we've heard from civil society about the United Nations Food Systems Summit itself, concerns about how it's structured, potentially further entrenching industry power. So we have to be sure that we're looking at where we're seeing conflicts of interest and exposing them and taking them on. The second is, yes, we need to be sure we are calling on every sector to play its part in this livestock transition, and more broadly, the systems transition we need across sectors, but we also have to be aware of false solutions. We're seeing as animal agriculture comes under fire for its climate impact, we're seeing some solutions emerging that aren't going to get us where we need to go. I just saw Chevron recently boasting about its recent partnership with California Bioenergy here in California, working with dairy farmers to produce and market dairy biomethane as renewable natural gas. And I was reminded many years ago of talking to farmers in the Midwest here who were dairy farmers talking about the pressure they felt to add more head to their herd, to get more waste, to be able to capture that waste in methane digesters that the state was actually subsidizing. So we need to be sure we're looking at where we're seeing false solutions, but also where we can take public dollars and put them toward the kinds of transitions we need. Probably many of you saw the recent UNEP, UNDP, and FAO report about public subsidies that estimated that more than $500 billion worth of resources have been subsidizing food systems, with a staggering 87% of those resources, or the equivalent of $540 billion every year, going to support harmful practices, particularly industrial meat and dairy production. So how can we capture those public resources and put them toward the kind of just transition that we are hearing 50 by 40 and its partners calling for? Third and final, yes, absolutely, we need to be talking about promoting individual change, but we need to make sure that that doesn't take industry off the hook. Yes, promoting diet change is so important. Today, as I mentioned, I'm publishing a book, half of which is a cookbook. We definitely need to be educating people about their diets and how to embrace a plant-centered diet, but we have to be careful that in our campaigning and in our messaging that we don't place the burden solely on us as individuals. Dietary change should be a beginning, but not the end of action. So in closing, I'm really excited to hear from everybody else we'll be hearing from today. As more and more of us are waking up to the destruction of the industrial livestock production systems and to the everyday joys of eating plant-centered foods and the planetary necessity of doing so, we are starting to shift what is politically possible. So I would just call on all of us not to be timid in our asks and ask for the reforms that we truly need, not just the ones that we think we might be able to win. We must be demanding the change that we know we need to meet our climate goals, to create a more healthy and thriving planet. So thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to the rest of our time together.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anna. It's a pleasure to hear from you as always. And don't be timid, make your demands. It's a really good point. Without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Charlotte for her introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Lasse, and 50 by 40 for having me today at this unique event series. So the changing climate forces us to effect massive and rapid changes in economic policy, changes that give rise to new vulnerabilities. Coal workers, for example, are facing job loss and lack of employability. Indeed, there are entire communities in coal-dominated towns that are threatened by declining tax revenues and loss of services. So in response to that, in the recent years, Just Transition has emerged as a movement that recognizes, on the one hand, that a shift toward a climate neutral economy is inevitable, but which also emphasizes that we must support workers and the broader community affected by such economic restructuring. So it's the public's responsibility as a whole to ensure that transitions which are necessary are also just. The Just Transition movement gained a foothold internationally in 2010 when the International Trade Union Confederation adopted its framework. This later led to the guidelines for a just transition by the International Labour Organization. And in the same year, in 2015, states acknowledged in the Paris Agreement's preamble the need for a just transition of the workforce. We have domestic policies today that are now committed to just transition. Think about the EU Just Transition Framework or the US Green New Deal. However, the concept's primary application has been in the coal and mining industry. Now, as we argue more generally, this makes little sense, since as the world aims to transition to a zero carbon society, other sectors contributing to global warming too must be subject to decarbonization. This is particularly true for agriculture, and the reasons for this have been laid out clearly by my colleagues or will be done so in a minute. But in a nutshell, if coal is the most polluting way to produce energy and must be phased out in a just manner, and animal agriculture is the most polluting way to produce food and also the most resource-intensive way to do so, then it too must be phased out in a just manner. So far, we've shielded agriculture from regulation mainly through mechanisms such as agricultural exceptionalism, or because we simply believe that our food choices are beyond the grasp of law and politics. However, this seems odd because the same piecemeal approach could have been used when it comes to coal. We could have said, let the energy consumers decide for themselves. Now, needless to mention, this is irresponsible because as we focus on coal alone, there are valuable years of curbing climate change that we lose. It's also irrational because, as Anna just mentioned, alternatives to carbon-heavy agriculture are fully available and accessible. Shielding agriculture from climate politics and law is also incompatible with our international commitments as laid out in the open letter. And finally, it's unjust vis-a-vis the agricultural workers who, at the point in time right now, they individually and alone bear the brunt of transitioning toward carbon neutral food production. But as consumers, as the ones driving demand, as providers of subsidies, and as governments, we have a responsibility to share here. And just transition by working towards sound investments and social dialogue on protection at the same time must eventually be part of this equation as well.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Very, very important points. And I really enjoyed to get the historical perspective of where things actually started. I do remember personally when Sean Borrow from the ITUC once was asked to, like, why is somebody working with workers and trade unions interested in climate change? And she said the famous words, there are no jobs on a dead planet. And that kind of resonated so strong. I mean, whoever gave her those talking points, or if it was herself, was super important for the conceptualization of this transition and how it relates to climate change particularly. So thank you so much, Charlotte. And now I would like to hand over the floor to AJ.
Thank you for this. Thank you for the invitation to have a global South farmer perspective in this important debate. And I think so it's a good call for a just livestock transition. For the record, Lasse, I'm not vegan. I'm not a member of a futuristic cult, nor am I a supporter of bat-grown protein industry. I speak for farmers. And the first question we must ask and change the narrative is, who is a farmer? The way backyard poultry is different from poultry industry, and rightly so, so is industrial animal production different from farming, and industrial animal production should not be termed farming in any debate, because this is what the industry is doing. They're using farmers as a shield to stall what everyone is trying to do, what we're trying to do to save the planet. So this nuance must come. I also think it's important to make we must acknowledge this. It's also widely acknowledged that the problem is existential. The reduction of emissions is not going to be enough, as you said. And one way to put the emissions and the carbon back is into the soil, into the terrestrial sink. And grazing is a good way to do it. And with better grazing, I think so we can achieve a lot of our climate mitigation targets. The other part I would want to say is that there is a nuance between eating habits between the West and the South, and that must be acknowledged. The Western diet per capita meat consumption is around 125 kgs. European consumption, I think so, is even more than that from the US. In contrast, in my home country, in India, it's 4 kgs. Maybe in Nigeria and in Africa, it could be 15 kgs. So one part of the world definitely needs to eat less meat, but that is not a call for others to eat more. And the demand for extra consumption of meat, inappropriate consumption, I mean, huge amount of meat that is being consumed daily, is driving particular farming practices in the global South. Because Lasse, we must understand that farmers do not grow out of choice. Farmers grow what governments incentivize or what consumers demand. So changing consumption demand, using activism to change government policies becomes very important. A transformation can be just and successful if producers, farmers, fishers, pastoralists all become a part of the process to design a policy and not mere supplicants looking for subsidies and aid as it appears to be now. We need to be at the table to design the policy, not just as showpieces, as has been seen at so many international and national regional events that we see happening again and again. One of the points that as a farmers organization, we have been constantly talking about for 4 or 5 years now, and we started this at the EAT Forum in Stockholm, I think so 5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, is consolidation in food value chains, which was brought up by an earlier panelist. And I think this is a crucial part that needs to be tackled. Activism, I think so, is very important. Activism is important for two things, for not only putting pressure on policymakers and governments and industry, but also for creating political space for policymakers to take steps which are good. So I would just leave it at that and say that there is a nuance about it, about who is a farmer, who's not a farmer, and who are we looking at for reducing consumption, who we are not looking at for reducing consumption maybe, and also to look at activism as a source. It cannot succeed. The transformation will not succeed if producers are not at the table and if their pain is not addressed. And just a point I forgot is, a lot of the conversations that you hear at international forums is repurposing of farm subsidies will do the job. I, as a farmer, I think, no, it will not do the job. We need to spend much more on farming, on transforming farming. Repurposing is not enough. Yes, we need to repurpose to change how they're being delivered, but we need to add more to that bucket and to that basket for the transformation to happen. Thank you so much. And we are here for the conversation.
Thank you so much, AJ. I cannot agree more with you. And it's so important that we have all stakeholders as part of this conversation. And as you have taught me so many times, it's so important, particularly from a farmer's perspective, when you talk about food, not to talk about the true cost of food, but the value of food, to embrace the holistic approach. And it's not just about what gets on the table in the production, but also who produces it and how it relates to their personal relations to the food and as people actually producing the food. So thanks a lot, AJ. Next, I would like to hand over to Helena.
Thanks, and great to be here today. I'm Helena Wright. I'm the Policy Director at FAIR, which is a 40 trillion investor network focused on the global food system. And our work actually helps investors to understand the ESG risks within the sector and also the opportunities. And as others have noticed already, really, we're at the start of this conversation when it comes to the agriculture and food sector. And we've already had quite a big conversation in the energy sector about the just transition, but we're just starting really our work on this. And you can expect to see more from FAIR actually in the coming year about the just transition topic. When it comes to climate change, as others have mentioned, there's really a kind of lack of disclosure on the pathway that we need to see. And actually FAIR's research has found that over 80% of the largest meat and dairy suppliers are actually failing to set or declare targets for their emissions. And that's a big financial risk because it means these companies will be underprepared for the low carbon transition as well. And we also found that over 11 billion of EBITDA is actually at risk by 2050 in 40 of the largest protein producer companies due to climate change, both in terms of transition risk and physical risk. So it's really important to understand the direction of travel, and that's extremely important for investors as well in terms of managing the risks in their portfolio. What we really need to see is a managed and an orderly transition towards a food system that's actually aligned with the climate and the biodiversity goals. And as the PRI has pointed out previously, actually in their inevitable policy response research, if we have an unmanaged transition, there's going to be more disruption, and that has implications for workers in terms of jobs and also producers. There's also a risk of stranded assets as well, where assets become uncompetitive before the end of their lifetime. And we've already seen actually several dairy companies going into bankruptcy in the US in recent years, which was partly driven by the shift to plant milk in terms of consumer demand. And those companies weren't prepared for that shift that was taking place in terms of consumers. So overall, it's really much better to be prepared for the opportunities of the low carbon transition, especially since agriculture is uniquely vulnerable to climate change and investors need better disclosure. And that's why actually recently 5 trillion of our investors actually launched a statement calling for better disclosure of agricultural emission cuts within countries' climate pledges, known as the NDCs. And that will provide more certainty for investors. So in fact, we're seeing that already in terms of the past week. We've just seen this new announcement made about methane emission cuts by the US and the EU. And I think we're likely to see more methane emission cut pledges to follow, actually, because the UN has said that methane is the best way to rapidly reduce emissions to avoid the most dangerous and catastrophic impacts of climate change in terms of crossing the tipping points within the climate system. So I think that would be an important one to watch in terms of the policy changes ahead. Also, I'd like to just quickly touch on subsidies. So as other speakers have mentioned, there's really an important role for shifting public finance to align with the climate and the nature goals. And a lot of investors that we speak to have made commitments to net zero, but they also need to see parallel action by policymakers. And since over 80% of the agricultural subsidies that we see now are going to activities that are harmful for nature and for health, according to the recent report that came out, this is going to be an extremely important topic. And a recent investor statement that we led as well actually called on the EU to better align its agricultural subsidies and to support farmers with a just transition mechanism to more sustainable farming. So finally, I think there's also a role for the development banks as well to examine how they're using funds to support farmers to the low carbon transition within the food sector. There's also a growing interest by investors in the plant-based food sector. This has grown rapidly, and some estimates actually show this sustainable protein trend increasing and taking up 60% of the protein market share by 2040, according to the high estimates. So the question is, how are farmers adapting to this trend? And is there a role for public finance to support farmers to adapt to the new market trends and also support the low carbon transition in terms of retraining workers and generating jobs?
Thank you so much, Helena. Super important points there, and I like the macro analysis of particularly of the financial flows and how it relates to policy. I think that's solving that puzzle. We're going to get more to that in the discussion in the end, but solving that puzzle is going to be important in the coming years. It's also great to have somebody who has such a great career within energy climate change policy to be in this space and help us sort things out. So with that, I would like to give the floor now to Adrian.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. So I work at the Inter-American Development Bank, where our main concern is economic development and the welfare of the people of Latin America and the Caribbean. So I wanted to start by explaining why, in the context of a region that still suffers a lot from the COVID crisis, I am here today talking about climate change and the transition of food systems. There's basically 3 reasons. First, I think we all know the climate crisis has continued to unfold during COVID, right? Every month we've seen record-breaking hurricanes, floods, wildfires, droughts, heat waves all around the world. And we know now that to stop the climate crisis, we will need to get to net zero emissions by around 2050. And that requires countries from all regions in the world to act. Second, the same countries and people who are affected, who are most affected by COVID, are often the people and countries who will also be most affected by climate change impacts. Just an example, street vendors, they couldn't work during lockdowns, and they also cannot work during heat waves. In the region, we think 2.5 million jobs, or the equivalent of 2.5 million jobs, will disappear by 2030 just because of the impact of heat waves on productivity. And of course, farmers are in the front line. And the third reason is that a post-COVID recovery that emphasizes a transition to a net zero economy can create 1% of additional growth and 15 million net new jobs by 2030 in the region. So now, food systems are essential for the transition to a net zero emission economy. First of all, 1/4 of GHG emissions in Latin America and the Caribbean come from agriculture. So that's mainly from fertilizers and from the infamous co-burps. But then you also have 1/3 of carbon emissions that come from deforestation. And deforestation mainly comes from beef consumption. 3/4 of the land is used either for grazing or for feed production. And now in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's a transitioning region, but it's the highest consuming beef region in the world. The beef consumption per capita is higher on average in the region than it is in the US. So that's why diet shifts to reduce beef consumption and to increase other meats or plant-based foods is essential to get to net zero emissions. Of course, other changes are needed, including agriculture upgrading and everything that needs to happen in energy. Now, very quickly, we think the way forward for government is to focus on a just transition. What does that mean? It means a positive aspect and a negative aspect. On the positive side, we think jobs in plant-based foods could more than double by 2030 if we do engage in the diet shift. But governments need to make sure that these jobs actually materialize, that the firms and the workers have the skills they need, and that they will enjoy decent working conditions doing these jobs. That's not going to happen automatically if you don't follow this policy. And also, we think up to 5% of jobs in livestock could be destroyed by 2030 during the transition. And here, governments need to hear the affected people, the affected communities, and try to compensate them. For instance, reskilling the farmers and investing in the local communities that are affected. So that, in a nutshell, is a few of the messages from a book, Jobs in a Net Zero Emission Future. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian. It's always great to hear from you as well. And I think you make some really important points. And I think the study you authored is really revolutionary. I know 50 by 40 is referring to it all the time because we haven't seen anything else that complex, really addressing something as big as two regions, essentially Latin America and the Caribbean. And the findings are really, really interesting. So thanks for doing that work, and always a pleasure. And now I'd like to hand over to Lana.
Thank you, Lasse, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I would like to add to what Adrian was saying in terms of Latin America. As a young Brazilian, I really see what is happening in the Amazon rainforest as a smaller scale example of some of these issues that we've been discussing in terms of industrial livestock. For instance, how industrial animal agriculture is the driving force behind the Amazon rainforest fires, but that often isn't talked about because this area is so often overlooked. How indigenous peoples are being the most harmed, and young people will ultimately be among the most harmed in this issue. And that is also going to be the case around the world, how this is being driven by consumer demand in the United States and in Europe for meat-heavy diets, which then leads to the production practices in the global South that end up harming the global South communities, and also how this is being enabled by the policymakers, the decision makers at a local and international level that allow this to continue to happen by the industry. So this is a lot of the issues that we'll then see happening around the world. I think it really plays out, and we can clearly see how climate and industry and food systems interact in a smaller scale. But something that really gives me hope is being around the youth movements. I think every single time that I highlight the youth movements that are addressing food systems and issues in industrial animal agriculture, there's more and more that I have to add to the list. So some of those are Food at COP, which is an international movement of young people from around the world that is pushing for climate-friendly food to be served at the UN Climate Conference or COP26, to walk the talk and having not only talking about climate action, but also demonstrating that and showing that the connection to food is important. There's also an international movement of young people called Youth Climate Save that has so many chapters, I can't keep count, definitely over 80 chapters around the world of young people that are addressing industrial animal agriculture issues and climate change specifically. And just in the last year, they've grown extremely fast and have over 10,000 followers already in social media. So they're really leading that cultural change as well. And we can also see in After Food Act for Change, one of the key priorities that came out of that was promoting plant-based diets as one of the biggest priorities that came from young people, over 65,000 around the world. So, and even in the UN Climate Conference, the precursor youth event, they are talking about, if you go to sign up, they talk about, are you okay with eating a plant-based diet throughout this event? Because we understand the massive impact from industrial animal agriculture. Young people are leading the way, and we need those people who at the UN Food System Summit at COP26 to not just say that young people are inspirational and that we are the future, but to follow the lead, because there's a reason why young people are addressing industrial animal ag, because we uniquely understand the urgency of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lana. Always a pleasure to hear from you. And also thanks for your amazing work in the Food System Summit and for ensuring that the voice of youth and indeed civil society is heard so strongly there. So now we are going to be going over to the panel discussion here. So this is the time where we can reflect on each other's introductions and bring up some topics. I encourage the panelists to raise their hands and come in if they have some specific comments. And I'm also going to be raising some questions myself, as well as bringing up some of the amazing questions we have been given from people who are attending the meeting via Slido. And I wanted to start with one of those questions. One question I think is very relevant for a lot of the comments that have been made here, and which is very like a sensitive and super important question, which is about the global North-South. So AC Baker is asking, how do we get the global North to take full responsibility for our historic and ongoing climate change emissions? And I guess in this particular case, it relates strongly to the Food System Summit and the emissions there, but it could also be extrapolated to the food system as such, in the way that it is the global North that are creating the problems and the global South that are suffering from it. So a lot of you already commented on that. So I wanted particularly maybe ask AJ just to come in on this one to start with, since you were very vocal on this when you were speaking. So what can be done to make sure the global North take responsibility for the historic climate change emissions, and in this case, how it relates to the food production?
I think climate change leads to poverty in rural areas in the global South, which leads to migration to the global North. Europe is already facing it in a big way. US is facing it in a big way. And with what I have seen in the last 10 years that I've been trying to focus on this topic, I see that activism is not, it does make a difference. The Paris Climate Change Summit came about because of it. But I don't think so activism is strong enough today, or will be in the next few years, to have a bigger influence than the consolidation in food value chains that exist, because they control the media, they control the narrative on how conversations form. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to be activism, and it's going to be pressure from migrations that come into this, and obviously climate change. It's not going to be an easy thing, but like I've said a few times earlier, the global south has been facing pain in many forms for many decades now. The north has been relatively safe from strife, from wars, from unrest, and it is when they face it, they will face more pain. They will not be able to handle that pain, and that is the tipping point where they will start to learn to change themselves. Like you have hurricanes, and you have cyclones, and you have flooding and drought, and this is what will make them change. I don't think. I mean, it's not a clear answer, but there are no clear solutions to this.
Thanks, AJ. It's so unjust, and I often think about the common but differentiated responsibility, which is a very strong part of the UNFSSC when it comes to climate change, and maybe also something that could be extrapolated to the food systems. Adrian, please come in.
Thank you so much. I just want to emphasize a complementary point of view, not to say that the responsibility of the North isn't historically what it is, but I also want to emphasize that today more and more it's becoming in the self-interest of developing countries to embrace a transition to net zero emissions. So we also have to think about shifting the lens, and not only thinking about, you know, the richer countries paying the poorer country to agree to sacrifice something to decarbonization. You know, in actuality, renewable energy is the cheapest source of energy in the world. Using public transits allows you to save, in many cities, like 1 or 2 points of GDP in time wasted in congestion. And for the theme today, new agriculture practice can improve yields, improve health outcomes, leverage ecosystem services. So we have studies, for instance, that show that in Costa Rica, it could be worth $41 billion to transition to net zero emissions by 2050. In Peru, it could be worth $140 billion. So again, I'm not saying the North doesn't have a responsibility, and I know I'm obviously French, so that's really not the message I want to say. I just want to say, don't forget that it's also in your self-interest, in many cases, as a developing country, to embrace in the transition.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adrian. Some really important points there. Anybody else wanted to come in on this? No, great. We'll leave Helena.
Actually, just to add to those points, I think we're already seeing that there's a high benefit of some of the sustainable protein investments that are being made by the private sector. So in a sense, some of this transition in the market to a more sustainable food system is already starting to happen, purely based on the sort of financial and economic and other benefits. But I think what we're failing to see at the moment is the alignment of the public policies and the public finance flows. And in fact, you know, some of the agricultural subsidies, as was mentioned earlier, are actually just embedding or entrenching or slowing down a transition, which is also ultimately harmful for the farmers themselves, as well as being harmful for health and climate and for the ecology.
Thanks, Helena. And AJ?
I agree with Andrew when he says that farmers in the global south, the people also have to participate in reducing their footprint and emissions. But lastly, I just want to put this point that it's the subsidies under WTO, the way the rules are framed, forces food prices to be artificially low. And that is what drives farmers in the global south, where subsidies are limited, to unsustainable agriculture practices. So theoretically, if you were to say that if there were no agriculture subsidies, I think farmers would get a better price, because ultimately subsidies only lead to lowering of prices to a point where it's beneficial only for urban consumers as such. I mean, not even only, I would say largely for urban consumers. So when you look, if you're trying to have a just transition, you will also have to look at reframing of WTO rules on agriculture and agricultural trade. Till those are not addressed, Don't expect farmers, small farmers, to change practices. Don't expect repurposing to change practices to a point where we can mitigate climate change. Let's be under no illusion that a net zero, if corporate houses paying money for net zero will make a transformative change in global south. There is not one single instance of carbon credit payments to smallholder farmers in the world today. It's all focused on the West, and the global south is not going to be a part of this transition. And the world and the North especially needs to understand that in the past 50, 60 years, in World War I and World War II, they have been trying to solve problems within themselves, like in the European Union or in the NATO. It's not possible with climate change. They'll have to work with other countries. They have to make sacrifices for other nations. Till now, they have been working for themselves. So it needs a great outlook change. It may seem pessimistic, but I think as a farmer from the global south, that's the real picture. WTO working to help other countries, not to help themselves. It won't work that way.
Thank you so much, AJ. A really important point. And yeah, you opened the issue of global trade, which is this magnificent beast that is so difficult to deal with in any circumstance, and particularly when it comes to livestock production, because of the complexities of feed and trade, and then how it kind of extends to most regions of the world. And just on that note, I'm already now wanted to put a little thought to all the panelists that in the end, I'm just going to ask for what you see as the biggest obstacle for creating that just transition and how potentially to overcome it. So at the end, I'm going to ask you to talk about that for 30 seconds to 1 minute as a final statement, so you can start thinking about that for a bit. I wanted to come back to one of the questions from the speakers, which is also very important because it speaks about the differentiation between different animal farming systems. So Jan Dekkers is asking, what do you speakers think about what counts as industrialized animal farming and non-industrialized animal farming? And is the former always worse than the latter? So it is a big question, and it's the ongoing question on extensive grazing versus feed and so forth. And any takers on this question? Charlotte, please come in.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate these questions, and especially as I think it forces us to become more clear and precise about the demands of just livestock transitions. So I think, first of all, and Lasse, you and I, we've talked about this in extensively over email as well, about just asking for a just transition or asking for a transition first, an acknowledgement that we need to consider agriculture as part of climate politics and law, and then also think about how we're going to do that, right? So regarding the first point, that a transition is necessary. Currently, as was mentioned before, we have Paris Agreement signatories, and most do not really mention agriculture in their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. We have a few that do, and to the extent that they do, they mention that they want to achieve that through intensification and finding technical solutions. However, when we look at animal agriculture specifically, we already know today that most of the growing demand for animal protein is already satisfied by intensifying production in factory farms, and their animals are housed indoors in extreme confinement, and we have pressures that are added to the environment and significant social justice issues that arise, and COVID-19 has uncovered obviously some of them. So one would think that de-intensification or more local and organic production would be the solution. But there's actually interesting studies such as by the Oxford University. They've done some of the biggest meta research with the biggest data set yet used to show that even the most de-intensified and organic animal products vastly outpaced plant foods in terms of their carbon footprint. So for me, the first question of that we need to zoom in on agriculture and that we need to address this is clear. The second is that we need to transition, so phase out animal agriculture as the most polluting way of producing food is the second point that's clear. And the more complex one is, I think, the how we're going to do that, right? So I think these are all issues that I really appreciate, you know, us coming together with lots of input coming from people working in the field, but also being affected by all of these restructurings we're talking about, that it should be part of the equation. And obviously, none of us, regardless of our expertise, have definite solutions for how this should work.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Really important points. And it is a very complex issue we're dealing with here. And I like the thinking about having it in a tiered system. Just a little process comment here. We have just over 10 minutes left. We will be going on with this event until 15:15 or 45 minutes past, depending on where in the world you are. Over to Anna.
Yeah, well, I'll be brief just to add on to what Charlotte said, to say that, you know, I think that when we're talking about this just transition, we're talking about shifting of systems. We're also absolutely need to wed that with a conversation about demand, the demand side piece, because you know, I've definitely with my own eyes seen really incredibly ecologically based integration of livestock on farms. And yet, if we were to consume even ecologically raised meat and dairy at the levels that certainly in the global north we are consuming, there's no way to make that sustainable. So whenever you talk about sustainable production, you have to marry that conversation with quantity, with demand. You know, in the US, I think the latest figures are 222 pounds per person of livestock product produced every year. I mean, that's just an unsustainable amount. But I will say that, you know, I've seen and really been inspired by, again, this integration of livestock on ecological farms. The very last place I traveled before COVID was southern India, in Andhra Pradesh, where I saw zero budget natural farming practices that were really integrating livestock on land. Working with funders through the Agroecology Fund, we've been supporting a lot of indigenous livestock and heritage breed livestock producers. So I think it's important that we really are clear that where the real impact, the climate impact, the health impact, the worker impact, it is in this industrialized livestock model, and that we really need to be clear that, though, at the same time, we absolutely cannot consume at the levels that we are in the global north right now.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Really important points. And I want to straight give the floor to Lana.
Just a quick point, just add in that some studies have also found, especially with more regenerative grass-fed, ends up taking more land, which is a huge issue when we look at the land use issues in agriculture. So just emphasizing again why, even if we are to shift to these kinds of more sustainable production that we're talking about, we really cannot afford to do that without the change in consumption.
Thanks a lot, Lana. Yeah, I think that's an important point. We need to consistently have an approach that aligns consumption and production. I have one more question, but just wanted to come to AJ as well on this.
I think the topic of agroecology and livestock in regenerative systems is not being studied enough, and public research is not focused on that topic. Just as FAO does not acknowledge that food value chains are a problem, consolidation in food value chains are a problem, the public system, the private system on agriculture research is not discussing these topics in same measure. That's why studies are not there to prove that it is not bad as it is made out to be. So I'm just saying there is scope for more funding going into research on agroecology and livestock, and to actually prove what's on the ground.
Thanks a lot, AJ. I wanted to come over to a very different kind of question. For those who don't know Slido, people post questions and then other people who are in Slido can like it. So the ones that get the most likes, which then from the viewers think are the most important ones, goes to the top. And I have one here who is at the very top from Frederica Schmitz, who's saying, speakers so far have given many good reasons for change, but no one has mentioned the animals themselves. We know they suffer horrendously in the industry. Is that not a reason to change? Any thoughts on that? Lana, please come in.
I'm happy to talk about this. I think animal welfare and the conditions of animals, for instance, especially in factory farms, industrial animal agriculture, is extremely important. But I've also noticed that wanting to affect change in mainstream spaces if they feel that you're talking about animal rights or talking about something that is too extreme for the UN or for Congress, you're not going to be let into the room in the first place. And that's something that I've noticed as someone who works with different youth organizations and initiatives, kind of from minimize your meat consumption to let's move to a vegan future. The ones that are on the more extreme side are not able to go into the spaces as much to affect change as presenting a more mainstream platform. So that's something that I've noticed.
Thanks a lot, Lana. There's definitely a lot of stigma attached to this conversation. I see Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Friederike, for raising this. I think it's a tremendously important point to raise. I am an animal scholar as well. So we in our work, we've drawn attention to the fact that animals should be considered as the ones we need to take care of in our discussions around climate politics and law as well. So currently we're framing our discussion around animals as potential drivers of climate change, right? Almost demonizing animals for doing so, even though we're the ones raising and confining them. And we're also not acknowledging the fact that they're being victims of such procedures, but they're also victims more broadly of climate change. Wild animals, for example, are hugely vulnerable to a global warming planet. And so I think that's an important conversation to have. I'm not precisely sure to what extent it can or should inform polity discourse or discussions at this point. I'm also a bit hesitant about it potentially being a turnoff, especially for more practice-oriented people who do not usually think about other animals, because we're animals as well, other animals in this discourse. But I think it's a valid point to raise at this point, yeah.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Yeah, I agree. You know, we are dealing with living, breathing beings. So it is a really important part of the equation as well. So we only have around 6 minutes left. Unfortunately, this is a fascinating conversation. I wanted to give each of you about maximum 40 to 45 seconds to just come in and answer the following question. So we know shifting to less livestock production would be good for the climate, for the people, for the economy, for most stakeholders, maybe not so much for the industrialized livestock industry. And I know probably some of my esteemed colleagues from the Food System Summit representing industry are on this call, and I understand that there is it's difficult question to address as well from the sector perspective. But knowing all the added benefits from shifting, why are things not moving quicker? What is the main blockage we're seeing in making this transition come much quicker, and how can we overcome it? So I'm just going to come in and ask one of you at a time to 40 seconds to address that. I'm starting with Adrian.
Hey, I don't think there's just one. I think it's the complexity of it. So there's we've set trade, subsidies, consumer demands. I think the key to move forward is for governments. First, recognize that a net zero future can be good. Then also recognize that there are a lot of problems and barriers to overcome. And discussing with the stakeholders, discussing with the farmers, discussing with the Ministry of Agriculture, discussing with the indigenous communities where reforestation affects them. How you can, map a transition from where we are today to where we want to go in 2050 that recognizes a multiplicity of challenges and tries to solve all of them over the next 3 decades.
Thank you. Complex problems demands complex solutions, definitely. I would like to hand over to Helena.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. I was going to say agricultural subsidies are one of the biggest barriers, but I actually think one of the biggest barriers might just be the sort of misinformation or misconceptions about what this, low carbon transition entails, and also the need really for better dialogue between different stakeholders to overcome some of those misconceptions. Another really big driver, I think, of the misconceptions, including among sort of policymakers and so forth, is probably also this problem of the lobbying, which others have mentioned as well. And actually, we brought out a quite interesting report recently around animal health, which you can find on our website. And that report found that there's a lot of expenditure within the animal health industry and the companies on lobbying, on antibiotics and other regulatory issues, although there's not enough transparency around what that lobbying expenditure is going towards. So investors are quite interested in more disclosure on this topic to ensure that the companies are aligning their own expenditure with the commitments that they have made. For example, there is some new frameworks being developed as well about responsible lobbying, so that might address some of these tensions perhaps as well.
Thanks a lot, Helena. And over to Anna.
Yeah, well, I would just echo so far what Adrian and Elena have already added. And, you know, I guess repeat myself here to say, I think one of the biggest obstacles is the incredible influence that corporate interests that have so many sunk costs in this current industrial model have, that influence that they have on public institutions. So we can see this recent report from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in Mongo Bay that found that the World Bank has approved nearly $2 billion in investments in Latin America and major factory farming operations and industrial livestock production. Like that kind of investment that is not only you know, kind of moving us in the wrong direction, but actually then meaning we have these systems that have been built that is going to be very hard to move away from. We're looking at in the US with the incredibly cheap gas prices that we've had through fracking and natural gas extractions, incredible new investments in massive fertilizer operations, which are again going to produce the livestock feed that is going to industrial production. So there is you know, these sunk costs that we have to deal with and this incredible influence of industry on public policy making. And I think it's where strong voices like 50 by 40, where we're really bringing together across sectors, unified voices for that kind of policy change that we need, is so vital. So thanks for bringing this conversation together, Lasse.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anna. And over to Charlotte.
So I find it a really difficult question to ask what the barriers and hurdles are to initiating just transition in this area. I think there's so many to mention. Most obvious one to me is a status quo bias, that we're just super comfortable with what we have today, and we don't yet feel the pain of needing to change anything about it, or at least those powerful players that still get to decide how this is being done. Another one is that the chain of connection is just too remote, right? We're thinking, how can such an innocent thing that we're doing, like having food and the pleasure of gastronomic you know, delight, can have an effect on the planet and kind of threaten our future, the future of future generations as well. So I think an important part of the equation, and I don't really like to talk about subsidies or taxes in that sense. I just really feel like the products that, food products that are now being produced have not properly internalized the negative effects that they're producing. We could simply just internalize these negative effects, which even an economic approach to law would urge us to do, and the world would look tremendously different from today. We would stop free riding on future generations, the environment, animals, and other people. And so I think it's also important, lastly, to mention that climate politics should, of course, not always be dependent on the 4-year term that politicians, you know, do their job on. So it's important to understand that governments do actually have a state duty to protect citizens, and that includes, you know, protecting them from climate threats. And I think governments have not fully taken this serious and also made that connection yet. And so I think it's an important duty for us to emphasize that.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Really important points there. We're running a slightly over time, but I think we can just wrap it up in the next 2 to 3 minutes. Lana.
I'll go quickly. I think a large one that I see is the perceived controversy around taking a stand on livestock, that it's just this scary, controversial issue that if you talk about it, there's going to be people yelling from both sides. And also speaking more specifically from the Food Systems Summit, not presenting it in a palatable way for governments, because they can be so picky about what you can and can't say and what they can get behind. So for instance, with sustainable consumption, getting it through the door as healthy diets, and then working on healthy diets from sustainable food systems from there. So working on finding a way where they can get behind the idea of a transition or something like that, and then shaping what that will be as we move along.
So important points and controversial indeed. Finally, AJ.
I think there's issue of political will to address losers in any transformation. People will lose, and that pain needs to be addressed. People don't have the political will. Governments are more focused on managing crisis management, especially with the pandemic. That's where the focus is. And lastly, I think most governments do not understand a systems approach. It's very complex. And when it becomes very complex, you don't want to think about it. And I'll just give an example. I think so today, President Biden has committed US $10 billion to end hunger in the world, in the UN. Now, it sounds very good, but where is that 10 billion going to go? Is it going to go into industrial farming subsidies to US farmers, which will be given as food aid to Africa and Asia, which will drive down farm gate prices for farmers in Africa, in the hinterland, which will compel farmers in the global south to grow unsustainably and reduce and relate to migration. You know, that's the food systems approach. If you look at it holistically, I don't think so policymakers have it in them, neither the political will, nor the vision, nor the understanding. That's the problem.
Thank you so much for that, AJ. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for this amazing conversation. It has been great to have you here today. I really enjoyed your contributions, and it's always sad we don't have more time to discuss. We could be discussing this for days. I also really hope to soon meet some of you in person if COVID allowed. A lot of us had planned to be in New York now, but obviously that didn't work out. Let's see about the COP. It's still planned to go ahead, but a lot of things can happen before then. But I look forward to continuing this conversation, and unfortunately, probably in the many years to come, we're not going to solve it in the next year or so. So the final thing I just wanted to introduce here is just encourage anybody who has been speaking here today, and anybody checking in and following the presentation here today, to sign the letter calling for Just Livestock Transition. Just go to the URL you can see here, 50by40.org, and support Just Livestock Transition, support JLT, or you can just put in the hashtag and things will come up. So thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you so much to everybody who tuned in today, and hopefully see many of you at the Food Systems Summit on Thursday, and see you the next big presentation and the next big round we do on Just Livestock Transition. This is the first steps, as has been pointed out now. It's very complex. It's going to take a long time, but together we can make it happen. So thank you, and have a continued lovely day, evening, and night.